Moving day, boxes piled high, the air was thick with anticipation and the scent of new beginnings. Parents and students alike bustled about, each carrying their own hopes and fears. Nervous excitement filled the air. Freshmen with wide eyes and anxious smiles navigated the labyrinth of hallways, each step echoing their uncertainty and eagerness. Dan, a lanky freshman, navigated the crowded dorm hallway. His heart raced as he clutched his room key. The weight of his new life pressing down on him, he found his room, heart pounding. The door stood before him, a barrier between his past and the unknown future, his new life about to begin. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever lay beyond that door. He pushed open the door. The room was a stark contrast of order and chaos. One side, neatly made bed, textbooks stacked. The other, chaotic mess, clothes strewn everywhere. It was a visual representation of the balance he hoped to achieve in his new life. Empty pizza boxes piled high. The remnants of late-night study sessions, or perhaps moments of procrastination. Dan swallowed, a knot forming in his stomach. His roommate arrived. The moment he had been both dreading and anticipating. Pale, thin, with dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, a ghost of a student.
Dale. His voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter him.
Dale mumbled, barely making eye contact. His presence was more of a shadow than a person. Dale seemed to exist in shadows, his voice a raspy whisper. It was as if he was hiding from the world, or perhaps from himself. Dan tried to start a conversation, but Dale just grunted, his eyes darting around the room. The silence between them grew heavy and uncomfortable. A wave of unease washed over Dan. This wasn't the roommate he imagined. This was something different, something unsettling. This wasn't the roommate he imagined. This was something different, something unsettling. Dan wondered how he would navigate this new chapter of his life with such an enigmatic presence by his side. The journey ahead seemed more daunting than ever. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The initial awkwardness never faded. Dale remained an enigma, a puzzle that Dan couldn't solve. He slept most of the day, curtains drawn tight, shutting out the world. At night he came alive, as if the darkness was his true home. Dan would lie awake, listening to the click-clack of Dale's keyboard, a constant reminder of his presence. Strange symbols filled his computer screen, symbols that Dan couldn't understand. Whispered conversations, too low to decipher, sent chills down Dan's spine. It was as if Dale was communicating with someone or something beyond this world. He tried to talk to Dale, to bridge the gap that seemed to grow wider each day.
"Hey Dale, can we talk?" Dan would ask, his voice tinged with desperation.
But Dale would only offer clipped responses, his eyes cold and distant, as if he was looking through Dan rather than at him. The sense of unease grew, twisting into something darker, something almost tangible. Dan started avoiding the room, spending more and more time at the library. Anywhere but there, where the air felt thick with tension. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with Dale. It was more than just odd behavior. It was as if Dale was hiding a dark secret, one that Dan was terrified to uncover. One night, Dan found himself staring at a locked drawer in Dale's desk, wondering what it contained. His curiosity battled with his fear. In the end, he walked away, unable to confront the growing dread that gnawed at him. The mystery of Dale remained unsolved, a shadow over their shared space. Dan knew he couldn't continue like this, but he didn't know how to change it. The room, once a place of rest, had become a prison of unease. And so the nights continued, with Dale typing away and Dan lying awake, haunted by the unknown. One afternoon, Dan returned to the room to find Dale staring intently at his belongings. Pictures from home, letters from high school friends. Dale didn't notice him, his gaze fixed and unblinking.
"Dale?"
Dan's voice was sharp, laced with suspicion. Dale flinched, startled.
Nothing.
He mumbled something incoherent, quickly shoving a small, leather-bound notebook under his pillow.
"What were you doing?"
Dan pressed, his voice tight.
Nothing.
Dale muttered, avoiding eye contact. He quickly gathered his things and left the room, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. Dan felt a shiver run down his spine. His gut screamed at him. Something was wrong, very wrong. The nightly ritual started subtly. At first it was just the soft murmur of Dale's voice. Then the chanting began, low, rhythmic, in a language Dan didn't recognize. One night he woke to find Dale standing at the foot of his bed, eyes wide, unblinking, staring intently at him.
Dale, what are you doing?
Dan gasped, bolting upright. Dale didn't answer. He just stood there, a strange smile playing on his lips. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and silently returned to his bed. Sleep eluded Dan the rest of the night. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through him. He was living with something he didn't understand, something that terrified him. The old oak tree outside their dorm window became an object of Dale's obsession. It wasn't just a passing interest. It was as if the tree held some deep, mysterious allure that captivated him entirely. He would spend hours staring at it, whispering to it. His friends noticed the change in his behavior, but no one could quite understand what drew him to the tree. It was as if he believed the tree could hear him, as if it held secrets only he could unlock.
One night I woke to a strange scratching sound. It was faint at first, almost like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder and more insistent, pulling me from my sleep. I looked out the window and there he was. Dale, in the dead of night, was outside, moving with a sense of purpose that was both eerie and unsettling.
Dale was perched precariously on a branch high above the ground. The moonlight cast long shadows, making the scene look like something out of a nightmare. He was carving something into the bark with a small silver knife. The blade glinted ominously in the moonlight, and I could see the intensity in his eyes, as if he was performing some sacred ritual.
I watched in horror as Dale slipped, dangling precariously for a moment before regaining his grip. My heart pounded in my chest, fearing the worst. It was a miracle he didn't fall.
He climbed down, his face flushed, the silver knife glinting in the moonlight. He seemed almost triumphant, as if he had accomplished something significant. Dan lay awake the rest of the night. The image of Dale and the knife seared into his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Dale's intense expression and the glint of the knife. He knew he had to get out of that room. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the air felt thick with tension. He couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him. He had to get away from Dale. The once friendly and familiar dorm room now felt like a prison, and he needed to escape the unsettling presence of his roommate. The tree incident had changed everything. Dan started packing his things, his movements frantic. He couldn't get out of there fast enough. As he was stuffing clothes into his suitcase, he noticed something under Dale's pillow.
The small, leather-bound notebook. I hesitated, then pulled it out. My name was scrawled across the front in a spidery handwriting.
He opened it, his blood turning to ice. Pages filled with bizarre symbols, diagrams and disturbing drawings, and notes, detailed notes about him, his daily routine, his friends, his family. A noise at the door made him jump. He slammed the notebook shut, his heart pounding in his chest.
Dale stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and rage.
He lunged for the notebook, but Dan was quicker. "What is this?" Dan shouted, holding the notebook out of reach. "What are you doing?"
"It's nothing," Dale hissed, his voice a menacing whisper. "Give it back."
"No!" Dan backed away, fear giving way to anger. "You've been watching me, writing about me. What are you planning?"
Dale lunged again, knocking the notebook to the floor. They grappled, a tangle of limbs and fury. Dan managed to push Dale away, scrambling to his feet. Dan didn't waste another moment. He grabbed his things and fled, the notebook clutched tightly in his hand. He requested a room change, explaining the situation to the resident advisor.
The RA, a jaded senior, listened patiently. He'd heard it all before, or so he thought. One look at the notebook, at the crazed scribblings and disturbing drawings, and his face blanched.
"Don't worry," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I'll take care of this." That night, Dan slept in a different room, a sense of relief washing over him, but the fear lingered. He knew deep down that this wasn't over. A few weeks later, Dan woke to a pounding on his door. It was the RA, his face pale and drawn.
"There was an incident," he said, ushering Dan into the hallway. The door to Dan's old room was ajar. Scratches marred the wood, as if someone had tried to pry it open. Inside, the room was empty. Dale was gone.
The RA showed Dan something else. Etched into the bark of the old oak tree right outside the window were the same bizarre symbols from Dale's notebook, and beneath them, a new message. "I'll be back." Years have passed. Dan graduated, moved on with his life, but he never forgot Dale. The memory of that year, of the fear and uncertainty, still haunted him. He often wonders what became of Dale, what dark path he might have followed.
He can't shake the feeling that Dale is still out there somewhere, watching, waiting.
And sometimes, in the dead of night, he can still hear the soft whisper of Dale's voice, chanting in the darkness. A chilling reminder of a time he'd rather forget.